Hi, everyone. We are recording. We are going to turn on the live transcript. There it is. So, yes, this is good stuff. I'm going to do that for myself. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I have a very handy dandy slideshow that'll get us started, and then I will turn things over to the wonderful, amazing Melissa Fay Greene, who will introduce us to this afternoon's event. So,
all right, but we'll wait till 4. There's only a couple of people here right now.
Oh, it's not even 4. Okay, yeah.
And then are you going to then start?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, that's the plan. This is exciting. I see people trickling in. Hooray, hooray. Well, while people are trickling in, I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat the link to Karis's virtual book booth.
Should I stop the recording?
No, it's okay. We know how to edit.
Okay. And we don't really need a recording of a recording.
Well, you would be surprised.
Yeah. And so do I not see the other people?
That's right. So this is a webinar, which means you can just see the other panelists, and the panelists cannot see each other. They can just see us. And, it's, yeah, we set it up that way just because of the screen share. The spotlight is on you. Mm-hmm. But we hope that people will comment and participate in the chat and things. People are coming in, looking good. Are you having fun at the festival so far?
Are you asking me or are you asking people here?
No, I'm asking you.
Yeah, I am. But I've had classes I've missed some events because I'm teaching at the time, but yeah.
Yeah, well, like all of the events, they're all recorded and we'll be putting them up on an Agnes Scott YouTube channel. And so they'll be available forever, or at least for as long as YouTube.
It sure would have been beautiful weather for an in-person festival.
Oh, I cannot tell you how many times I have thought that over the last 13 months. The Decatur Book Festival weather was exquisite, and this is exquisite. And
yeah,
it just isn't right. Okay, I think we should go ahead and get going, since we're pretty much there. Hi everyone. I have put in the chat the link to Karis Books' virtual book booth, and I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. I'm sure you're all tired of having screens shared at you by now, but such is the Zoom universe. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Nicole Stammet, and I am Associate Professor and Chair of English here at Agnes Scott College, and you are at the Agnes Scott Writers Festival 50th Anniversary Celebration. We are so happy that you've joined us for this special From the Archives event, in which we have Agnes Scott's Kirk distinguished writer Melissa Fay Greene talking with us now and looking back into the past about her appearance as a Writers Festival guest. Commemorating 50 years of the Writers Festival provides a unique opportunity to see where the festival has been and how that history connects to the present of writing. To continue our week-long celebration, we are hosting returning guests, poet Rita Dove and playwright Jacqueline Goldfinger, tomorrow. All events start tomorrow. I'll put the full calendar in the chat as well. But here you have a schedule of events if you want to quickly jot them down. And I haven't nailed the landings on the virtual events, but I'm going to try again. And I hope to be able to share this with you at the end of our conversation today too. All upcoming Writers Festival events can be accessed via calendar.agnescott.edu. And please take a look at Karis Books' virtual book booth. The link is in the chat, which has information about how to purchase some of the works featured this week. We hope that you will join us again in just a couple of hours at 6:30 as we hear poet Tiana Clark give a reading as part of the Georgia Poetry Circuit. We are thrilled to be a hosting institution for the GPC, and Tiana Clark was mentioned in the New York Times earlier today, so it's perfect timing. But for now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Melissa Fay Greene back to the Writers Festival stage. So I've stopped my share. Melissa, we are all yours, and then I will share my screen again and we'll watch your video.
Hi, you all. Thank you for coming to this weird event. It's a little embarrassing to be pulled out of someone's archives. This is not 50 years ago. I don't care how often they mention it's the 50th anniversary. This is not from 50 years ago. I looked at a little bit of this talk when Nicole first sent it to me. My two strongest reactions were, first, that I still give this talk. This book is still taught, Sheetrock is taught all over the country, in colleges and graduate schools of journalism. So I'm still invited to give this talk, but I think a lot of things have fallen away over the years. So I'm going to take notes and remember some of the anecdotes that I've lost over the years. Actually, another impression, this would be number two of three, not of two, but another impression is, I think some of the best stories come from material that was taken out by the editors. I knew it was good material. There's really funny stuff about Long County, which is next door to McIntosh County. The book's about McIntosh County on the coast of Georgia, but Long County had all kinds of ridiculous shenanigans going on. But the editors sort of didn't get it and felt it was too far off the track. And so the Long County material was taken out. And then there was a big publishing event for the book in New York City, and a big, elegant restaurant, and just a beautiful, I just sort of remember a long table, white tablecloths, and all kinds of elegant Manhattan delicacies. And they were all looking at me, and I started telling stories, and I started telling the Long County stories, and they were just screaming, they were just howling. All these people love these stories. And my editor for the book was sitting at the far end of the table. And in the midst of all this hysteria, I looked down the table at her, and she was like, oh yeah, I got it. Like, okay, I screwed up. But of course, once it's out of the book, it's out of the book. So I think some of those stories, I think I tell in this talk. I remember this talk being really fun. I remember Christine bringing me and introducing me, and that was my first time, I think, meeting Christine. And the third and final thing is that, of course, I will look shockingly young in this talk, but honestly, that's what I still think that I look like. It's not that I see that when I look in a mirror, but I do feel that when I don't look in a mirror. So take a step back in time with me and Nicole, with Nicole twisting my arm behind me. We will step back in time, but not 50 years, only to 1994.
Thank you, Melissa. Yes, it is really exciting to step back in time. So I'm going to share my screen, and we are going to enjoy this video. Share. So there you see Professor Cousins. I'm just going to give the tiniest snippet where she says, welcome, and then, she's going to take it away. Enjoy, everyone. Can you hear it? No.
No.
Of course not. Of course not. Okay, I'm going to try again.
You need to do share sound. Did you do?
Yep. I promise. I'm getting there. Okay.
We are especially happy to welcome Melissa Fay Greene to our Writers Festival this year because she is one of Georgia's own. Born in Macon, Ms. Greene lived in Ohio and received her BA at Oberlin College, but sensibly returned to her native state in 1975 to work with Vista as a paralegal assistant in the Savannah office of Georgia Legal Services. While in Savannah, she began the research which became the basis for Praying for Sheetrock. Ms. Greene has published in many national periodicals, including the New York Times Book Review, the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, the Atlantic, and the Washington Post. She is currently at work on a new book about the bombing of the temple in Atlanta in 1958. This book will provide, in her words, an analysis of the city's approach to civil rights in those years. I know we all look forward to reading about an event that so marked the history of our city. Please join me in welcoming to this first event in Agnes Scott's 1994 Writers' Festival, Melissa Fay Greene.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks to those of you who came of your own free will and those of you who had this as an assignment. I know who you are. We'll try to be entertaining. I'm delighted to be part of your festival, and the student work in this book is really just terrific and very moving, and I really compliment all of you that contributed to this. Well, Praying for Sheetrock is my first book, and I was working on it off and on over a period of about 15 years. I realized a few years ago that many of the greatest stories I'd ever heard, the funniest, the most touching, the most outrageous, the most stirring, all were coming from the same place, this isolated little county on the coast of Georgia, McIntosh County, population about 7,000. As Christine said, I was born in Macon. I left there at the age of 6, grew up in Dayton, Ohio, went to Oberlin. And when I graduated from Oberlin in '75, I moved back down to Georgia, to Savannah. Almost as soon as I stepped foot back in the state, I started hearing McIntosh County stories. They just kind of wafted up the coast. My first memories of settling into Savannah in '75 include hearing stories about the S&S truck stop. And what people said about it was, you can't buy a gallon of diesel, and you can't fix a flat tire, and you can't get yourself a cheeseburger, and it's the busiest truck stop in the state. Those of you who have read the book know that the S&S actually was a house of prostitution, a center for gambling, numbers, narcotics, and gun running, and a haven for criminal fugitives throughout the South. In '75, the main thing we knew about it was that it had a set of dry, empty gas pumps sitting up front. A prominent Savannah attorney told me when I asked him about it, the S&S? Oh yeah. The year I was president of the Civitan Club in Savannah, we drove down the coast to the S&S for a club outing, kind of a field trip. Naked girls in harem costumes met us at the door. There was blackjack, dice, slot machines, screw movies, the works, and trailers out and back for those adventurous enough. We had a hell of a good time. Come on back, some damn fool told his wife, and that was the last trip the Civitans ever took. My daughter is 12 and wanted to try reading the book, so I gave it to her, and she came back to me after a little while and said, I think I found a mistake. And I said, what? You know, and she'd found this line that I just read you, naked girls in harem costumes. She said, isn't that a contradiction? Give me the book. Everybody's a critic. The S&S truck stop basically was the headquarters for the criminal activities of Tom Poffel, who was the elected sheriff of the county. Also, in my first weeks back in Georgia, I heard people talking about the wreck of the Snickers truck. A big semi-trailer had crashed and burned while traveling down the coast through McIntosh. The State Department of Agriculture had inspected the cargo and condemned the food as inedible and asked the local authorities to dispose of the Snickers, and they said, we sure will. So the Snickers disappeared for about a week. Then the Snickers started surfacing, and pretty soon they were everywhere. They were in every little truck stop and diner and restaurant and service station. I was working as a Vista for the statewide legal aid program at the time, and we circuit rode to 18 rural counties. And we talked about the fact in our office that it used to be that you'd go call on a client in some rural county, and they would offer you a saucer with a slice of cake and a nice glass of iced tea. And there was this period of several weeks where all anyone offered anybody was Snickers. And they would give it to you on a plate with the wrapper sort of unappetizingly folded down for you. That was McIntosh. One of its chief forms of revenue was the wreck of interstate trucks. The other story that was famous when I first... You laugh. This is, in fact, when I was doing the interviewing in McIntosh, I learned fairly early on that a good opening gambit in conversation was to ask people if they fondly recalled any truck from their childhood, and people always had. They would say, Yes, we remember, you know, the canned goods, or there was a truck with first stoles wrecked one time, or one time there was a truck with guns, one time there was a truck with oranges went spilling all over the highway. The trucks were wrecking both out of normal interstate traffic, and trucks do wreck, and these were in the days before I-95 had been completed down the coast. But some trucks were deliberately disabled. Many of the trucks were disabled while they were parked at the S&S truck stop, which was the reason the S&S was there. The third story that was famous when I first moved back to the coast had just happened, and this was fast becoming known as the Night on the Marshes. The McIntosh County Sheriff and his deputies were in the marshes awaiting a drug load. I was told by one former state trooper that Popple had been one of the first to import marijuana into Georgia, and what the state trooper said was he was kind of a pioneer in his way. So the sheriff and the deputies were in the marshes awaiting the arrival of a drug boat from Central America. Unbeknownst to the sheriff, there were also DEA agents and customs agents out of Savannah, also in the marshes, who had been alerted that a drug boat was coming, and they were hoping to catch Sheriff Popple in the act of bringing the drug boat in. When the boat came into view and the deputies signaled it and it came closer, the drug agents began running toward the sheriff to catch him in the act of bringing in this drug shipment. But the drug agents were all undercover. They had long hair and beards and blue jeans, and the sheriff thought that they were druggies trying to intercept his shipment that he'd gone to the trouble of bringing into town. So he started shooting at them, and they started shooting back, and the drug boat kind of hesitated in the water. Here were all these law enforcement people firing at one another, and the drug boat turned and started heading back out into deep water. And when the customs agents got close enough, they showed their badges to the sheriff, and as legend had it, the sheriff went from shooting at the customs agents and began firing on the boat, calling back, "Thank God you boys got here in time." US 17, which was the state route that still runs through McIntosh County, was familiar to me already. My father was a Civil War buff, and we spent many summer vacations driving around Georgia and visiting old Civil War battlefields. So our house, first in Macon and later in Dayton, Ohio, was full of Mr. Peanut keychains and Confederate flags and rubber-tipped Indian spears and black tin Coca-Cola serving trays and rubber alligators, which our family had purchased from the little roadside stands that were all along US 17 and the other back roads. When I moved back to Georgia in '75, I was able to see the very last of this culture, because with the completion of the interstate, it wiped out all of those little roadside businesses. McIntosh was the last place on the coast that the interstate was completed. Again, legend has it that it was Sheriff Popple that was able to keep it unfinished in McIntosh for so long. That was one thing I was not able to verify. It's probably true, though. What I also saw the very last of when I moved back to the coast in '75 was another type of roadside establishment that was peculiar to McIntosh County and to Long County and a couple of the others, which was a little roadside business called a clip joint. And the clip joint was a little business that looked like the little roadside stands that sold peaches or pecans. But in fact, when the basic tourist family, the station wagon, the children in the back seat, the oranges on top, when they would pull over and go into one of these, looking to buy a bag of pecans, what they would find out when they stepped inside was that what this business was actually offering was gambling. And the little businesses in McIntosh County, the clip joints, had little wire mesh containers full of silver dollars that would be on some sort of little motor, and they would be turning and turning and turning. And when people later wrote to the governor to complain or contacted the state troopers or whatever, they would talk about these silver dollars. I couldn't think that dollars were clanging and clanging and clanging, and you could win all the money. So there were games set up in McIntosh County for gambling. The gambling, of course, was all rigged. It was impossible to win these games, and they were the most successful businesses in McIntosh County. My husband and I lived in Rome, Georgia for a couple of years. My husband clerked for the federal district judge up in Rome, and we had a friend visit from Baltimore one summer, and he said he wanted to see some rubes. He'd never been south of the Mason-Dixon line and wanted to see some rubes. So there was a county fair at the time, so we took him to the county fair. We thought this will be a good place for him to see whatever he needs to see. Stepped inside the county fair, walked 10 paces, and there was a little stand set up. There was a game, and we started to play this game. We could not get the money out of our pockets fast enough. We spent $70 on this game in about 6 minutes, and had totally been cheated out of all our money. We were very shaken up by this. After we spent every penny we had, and I was pregnant at the time, and the man even took pity on us and gave us back $1 so I could get a hot dog. And we couldn't do another thing at the county fair except go look at the cattle, because everything else cost money. But really, it was an awful experience. Years later, when I was researching this book, I found that the game that was offered in the clip joints along McIntosh County was in fact the same game. It was a game called Razzle Dazzle. I hadn't known the name of it at the time, but I never forgot this game because I'd never been to Las Vegas or anything. We didn't realize we were gambling. You know, if there'd been a candy apple booth first, we might have done that. As it was, we went to this game, but it's this incredibly rigged game, and this is what was offered all along McIntosh County. To win at this game, Razzle Dazzle, you've got to throw 8 dice. And to win, you have to get the 8 dice to total 48. And there's big signs up. There were big signs up in the little roadside and clip joints saying 48, instant winner, and you win the silver dollars, or you win the color TV, or there's all sorts of things you can win. But how do you roll a 48 if you're rolling 8 dice? You have to roll 8 sixes. And what are the odds of doing that? The odds of doing that are, it turns out, 1 in 1.7 million. You're not going to roll a 48. The other number that's an instant winner is an 8 if you can roll 8. So if you can roll 8 snake eyes, instant winner, you get all the silver dollars, but you're not going to roll that either. It's much more likely when you roll 8 dice and add them up, it's much more likely that you'll roll a number like 24. That's a more typical sum that you'll get when you roll your 8 dice. 24, what do I get? And you look at the chart and 24 earns nothing. So they had what was called a conversion chart up that told you what you would win. So I got to see all of that and learn about all of that by interviewing a man who is now the chief of police in Dougherty County, a man named Bill Kicklighter, who was the state trooper watching all of this in McIntosh, and he had some of the game boards still and the conversion charts and so on. So at any rate, the Yankee family would get out of the car, walk in, and would be told, hey folks, purchase of $5 or more, give you a free throw of the dice. And this was the game of Razzle Dazzle. People would realize they'd been cheated. People would lose all of their vacation money or all of their retirement money. The people heading south to Florida. No one to this day knows how many thousands and thousands of dollars of Yankee, retirement and vacation money was lost in this 1.5 mile stretch under the pine trees. People would walk out and realize they'd lost all their money, and they would drive straight into town to the sheriff's office to report it. And what they would be told then was, son, don't you know gambling's a felony in Georgia? You want to start serving time now, or you want to continue on with the trip? And people would go on and would have lost all their money. So that was McIntosh County, and that was the first layer of stories that I heard. I was telling our friend here that I had a whole chapter in the book about Long County, because in doing the research on McIntosh, it naturally overlapped with Long County, which was right next door. The county seat of Long is the town of Ludowici, which is nationally famous as a speed trap. So I was privileged to get a glimpse into the way the speed trap worked in Ludowici. In Ludowici, the speed limit inside the city limits was 25 miles per hour, and people did jail time for going 26 miles per hour. It was in the years before you were able to surrender your driver's license in lieu of bail. So if you were arrested and it was after the banks were closed or it was on a weekend, people would be locked up and their family would be shown to the local motel, which was only 2 police to accommodate. And they would stay in jail until they could get the money wired from Massachusetts or New York, wherever they'd come from. Let me see if I brought it. I was going to read you a little bit of the Long County material. This is the one piece of the book that if I'd not been a first-time inexperienced, eager to please author, I would have fought for this material a bit more, I think, because I liked it. The editor was one of the classic New Yorkers that has never, crossed the Brooklyn Bridge without feeling alarmed, and sort of didn't get it and thought it would be too confusing to have 2 different counties in the book. She thought it was enough to have just one county. I'll read you a little bit of the Long County stuff. Next door to McIntosh lay the neighboring landlocked kingdom of Long County. It was ruled by a strong man, the equal of Sheriff Popple, a sort of fellow baron in an age of peasants, the retired city solicitor, Ralph Lane Dawson. Everyone called the man Colonel Dawson, and not because he'd ever served in the armed forces. You pick a drunk up off the street, said a former GBI agent, and he'll tell you, call Colonel. Colonel tell you I'm all right. Colonel Dawson was an angry-looking, jowled, heavy-set, small-eyed man who smoked cigars and wore ill-fitting clothes. He looked like the mascot Georgia Bulldog. He looked like what the rest of the country thinks a Georgia sheriff looks like, except in this story, the sheriff is a slender, neatly coiffed man in a summer linen suit and white spats, and it's the lawyer who looks like that. Under Dawson's influence, election rigging in Long County became so effective that one year a voter turnout of 115% was recorded. There are many roads leading out of Ludowici, a group of local officials told Brenda Mooney, the journalist who reported that fact in the local paper, and we'd like you to be on one of them in the next 5 minutes. Under Dawson's leadership, the county seat of Ludowici became nationally famous as a speed trap. It was named America's premier speed trap in 1953 by the American Automobile Association and held the title until 1971 when Georgia Governor Lester Maddox outfoxed Colonel Dawson. For years, the AAA issued maps to its 7.5 million members, highlighting state routes which ought to be taken to circumvent Ludowici. One of my mother's friends, going through old stuff, came across one of these maps. She'd been a AAA member at some point, in the 60s or something, and brought my mother this old map that has stamped on it speed trap and had roots drawn around it. Ludowici had no natural resources or industry, but it was located at the crossroads of three highways, US 301, Georgia 99, and US 82. Tourists traveling down the coast of Florida from New York and New England hit Darien, that's McIntosh County, and they hit the clip joints. But the rest of them, those from the West and Midwest, took US 301 and hit Ludowici where the speed limit was 25 miles per hour. Like Darien, Ludowici relied upon out-of-state drive-through traffic as its major resource. Unlike Darien, Ludowici did not trouble itself with the overhead involved in running restaurants, motels, service stations, or even peach stands. Ludowici simply lowered its speed limit, expanded its police force, and enhanced its revenue. In the old days, when I was a kid growing up in the early 50s, said Police Chief Bill Kicklider of Dougherty County, a Long County native, they'd lay down two lines across the road, looked like rubber hoses to measure speed. You'd cross one and then hit the other one, in some kind of way it would calculate your speed. Every sheriff in Georgia had a set of them, and back in those days, the sheriffs worked off a fee system. The more tickets they wrote, the more their salary was. The sheriffs got wealthy. He told me they had sheriffs driving Cadillac police cars. Quote, I remember one day about 1950 being in a car with an uncle of mine. I was just a youngster. We crossed one of them rubber strips coming into the city limits of Ludowici, and there was about 6 or 7 deputies standing there, and the sheriff. We crossed that thing, and I can't do his accent justice. This is one of my favorite two voices in the book, Chief Kicklider. The editor also didn't get that, and was afraid I was going to have to subtitle the book, the biography of Bill Kicklider, but she was wrong. We crossed that thing, and my uncle said, uh-oh, but they knew us. They just looked at us and gave us kind of a disappointed look, kind of grinned, and we went on by. And my uncle laughed about that all the way home. He said, it's a good thing I'm a registered voter over here. We'd have gotten a ticket. The one Long County traffic light in the center of Ludowici is supposed to have been operated by remote control. A hidden deputy caused it to change from green to red without passing through yellow when an out-of-state car entered. And Chief Kicklider said they had a button that let a guy get up to and mash it. Car would run on through the light because he'd be right on it when they'd mash it. When he'd get through, they'd run him down, and I believe that. Across America, there are many exemplary citizens, captains of industry, leaders of government, who will, if pressed, confess to having served time in the Ludowici City Jail. They were using radar in Long County, said Doug Moss, this is a state trooper, back when nobody else in the country outside the military had radar. So that was McIntosh and Long County. This was the first layer of stories that I encountered. They're the kind of stories that are loved along the coast. In fact, when I began interviewing people a couple of years ago for the book, the reaction I got from probably a third of them was, damn, that was the book I was intending to write. As I worked my way up the bureaucratic ladder of state and federal law enforcement personnel and introduced myself on the phone or in person, there'd be total silence and incomprehension. I was often trying to interview people who were not used to being on that side of the tape recorder. These were people that had done, criminal investigations all over the South. They were not used to being questioned. Usually I'd get this kind of thing until I'd get to my first question. Can you tell me anything about McIntosh County? And the reaction was usually an explosion of laughter. Hell yes! When I asked people in McIntosh if they remembered the Sheetrock truck or the Snickers truck, they'd say yes, and how about that shoe truck? There was a truck with fur coats once, or we got guns off the truck one time. And when I made a Freedom of Information Act request to the FBI about Sheriff Popple, I received, after a few months, thousands of pages, boxes and boxes and boxes of documents. They basically had to back the truck up to my door. And every one of these documents was stamped armed and dangerous. And this was the elected sheriff of the county they were writing about. So that was the first layer. The second layer of stories I heard from McIntosh County were political. And these arose from the African American community, which had gotten in touch with the legal aid lawyers and was using the Brunswick lawyers to help right a system of wrongs descending from slavery times, including the virtual total exclusion of blacks from the economic and political life of the county. It was these stories that really drew me into the county. The stories about Sheriff and US 17 are wonderful, but they're the sort of stories that if you spend any time at all kind of rocking on your front porch and drinking a beer, and on a summer evening, someone will come out with one of these stories. I don't think I would have begun commuting to McIntosh in search of more of those. But the image of this isolated and poor black community, left behind by racial progress in a lot of the rest of the South, suddenly challenging the powerful and armed dynasty of Sheriff Popple, was incredibly exciting. It was a glimpse of something I had no hopes of witnessing. It was already 1975. I had minored in history. I'd studied the World Wars and the Depression and the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. It was in the textbooks already. I'd already had exams on the Civil Rights Movement and had done nicely on them. And I didn't realize it was still going on out there. Suddenly here it is, the summer of '75, and I find myself in the midst of a full-fledged, full-blown civil rights movement. I was just a month or two out of college. So one of the first things I realized was the fact that civil rights battles had been fought and won elsewhere meant nothing here, that the people here had to start from scratch. I was told by some of the old people in the county, I quote a man named Deacon Thorpe in the book, saying, Martin Luther King come as far south as Atlanta, but he never did come here. And it was sort of this confession by the older generation. They had waited for Dr. King to come and bring them the civil rights movement. I spoke in Albany, Georgia, a couple of weeks ago, which is in the process of commemorating the Albany movement there. And Dr. King did come to Albany, and they have a totally different story to tell, and they have a civil rights park now where they commemorate the various things that happened there in a civil rights museum. But Dr. King never did come to McIntosh County. He obviously could not get to every county in the South or in the country. So in McIntosh, it fell to a younger generation to realize, hey, the man's not coming, and that they would have to do it themselves. I first visited McIntosh, which is about an hour south of Savannah, at the invitation of one of the lawyers in my office. He'd been asked to address a meeting, the purpose of which was to find plaintiffs who would sign their names to the first lawsuit being prepared against the county, charging discrimination in the selection of jurors. This was the first case that was brought because one of the first complaints that the citizens came to the lawyers with was the fact that there had only been one black member of the school board, an elderly man. He'd just been thrown off the school board for no reason and replaced with a white, so that the school board was now all white men. Why had this happened? They suspected it was because the elderly black man was suspicious that public school board monies were being diverted from the all-black public school system to the all-white private school system, and that these monies were being diverted by an all-white school board, which presided over the all-black public school system. So the lawyers looked into why are there no women or black people on the school board? Where does the school board come from? It's appointed by the grand jury. Let's look at the grand jury, all white men and always had been. Let's look at the trial juries, again, all white men and always had been. So the initial lawsuits that were prepared were against the way the jury system, against the selection of jurors, charging discrimination against women and against blacks. My colleague had been asked to address several issues of special concern. Could the black McIntosh County citizens be arrested if they sued the county? Could they be fired from their jobs? Could they be evicted from their homes? Would they be harassed? The answer to all these questions obviously was legally no. But in that time, in that place, the idea that law might inhibit the actions of powerful local people was a very novel idea. And even if the local black people were to accept this new idea, who was to say that the local white people would accept it? The African-American community had been free with details in response to the lawyers' many questions when the lawsuit was being prepared. But now they were being asked individually to come forward and sign their names to this lawsuit, to experiment with the abstract force of law, to trust the U.S. Constitution and the young, white, eager legal aid lawyers with their beards and blue jeans, their peasant glasses and sandals, enough to sign their names to this lawsuit. So my friend, the Vista lawyer, had been asked to come and offer what encouragement he could, the Constitution as ally, presented to people who had been taught to fear ropes, dogs, guns, jail, and poverty. The lawyer and I drove south out of Savannah through Liberty County and Bryan County and slowed up shortly after we crossed the McIntosh County line. McIntosh is just a magnificently beautiful coastal county. In those days, even in the 70s, it was just dark with forest. The forest has been thinned a good deal now by the timber industry, but in those days it was like just driving into a tunnel. It was so dark. You would just drive into these trees, into this coastal pine forest. So we were driving into the darkness of this pine forest, and then there was a clearing on the left, Bare light bulbs dangled from tree branches to illumine the sand parking lot of the Calvary Baptist Fundamental Independent Missionary Church. We parked there. If it was 95 degrees in the parking lot, it was 120 degrees in the church. Every pew was packed, well-dressed people lined the walls and crowded the rear of the church, and a choir in red satin robes was leading the congregation in loud, gorgeous hymns. I sat primly in the front pew beside my friend, where space had been cleared for us in the midst of this chanting, singing crowd as honored guests. We were the only whites in the room. I was to repeat this experience many times. As I did the research in the county, I was often invited to the various church services and always was seated right up front, the only white person for miles around, and would do my best to keep up with what was going on. It's hard when you're in the front row because you need to kind of see, when are people standing up or leaning back and forth or whatever. On one of my last trips to the county, there was a pause in the service, and the minister asked if I would like to come up and lead a hymn. I thanked him but declined, explaining that there were two problems with it, really. One was that I could not sing like that. I mean, you can imagine these magnificent gospel choirs. And the other problem was that I was Jewish and didn't know the words. Welcome to you, he cried, the black and the white, the Greek and the Jew. We're all children of Jesus. I'd never heard it put quite that way before. It's not what the rabbis teach you. Meanwhile, several people nearby reached over to shake my hand. That first night, the lawyer and I sat for hours in the midst of this glorious, heartfelt, thunderous prayer service, wondering when the meeting we had been invited to was about to begin. Meanwhile, the songs led by the choir went into 10, 11, and 12 stanzas, and the prayers offered by the minister became lengthier and more ornate until the hour grew late, the moon rose, and the marsh frogs beyond the sand parking lot began honking. At some point, it dawned on us that this was the meeting. And at that point, my friend quietly laid aside his typewritten notes that he prepared. He was going to speak on the history of discrimination in McIntosh County. He realized that probably was not going to be called for. The people, we realized, were fairly well resolved to proceed with the lawsuits, and they were going to find plaintiffs among the congregation. But that night, they were praying to God for the courage to proceed. And it was my first glimpse of a phenomenon that I again saw repeatedly, which was that in McIntosh County, God himself was invited to the meetings, and this was a sort of religious political meeting. It was a combination. It was absolutely political, but it was absolutely religious at the same time. The leaders of the black community were very brave. They were inventing and borrowing strategies like mass demonstrations and boycotts. And then they hooked up with these friendly, peppy, disheveled-looking legal aid hippie lawyers who were not from McIntosh, most of whom were not from the South. And they had to make this calculation whether or not to trust them. The lawyers were also brave, but they were not at risk in the same way. They went home at night to Brunswick and to St. Simon's Island and to Savannah, and only one of them in future years would even remain on the coast. But the black people were not going anywhere, and they were being asked to trust this abstract idea of law with their lives and futures. I wrote about it like this in the book. I'm going to read you 2 paragraphs. And it's kind of a central moment in the book where the African-American leaders are having to make this appraisal of these kind of hippie white boys. This Constitution of which they were so fond, with which they felt so intimately acquainted, housed in distant Washington under glass, indecipherable script fading from parchment, it spoke to the black people, for the black people, and would protect the black people, according to the lawyers. The Constitution, the black leaders came to understand, was the white boys' Bible, and the lawyers quoted it often, chapter and verse, taking secular pleasure in its ornate language every bit as much as the rural people relished the antiquated resonance of biblical thou shalts and wherefores and comeths and goeths. But was this religion or was this fact? When the lawyers promised the protection of the Constitution, was it similar to, or was it not similar to, Reverend Grosvenor assuring parishioners of the love of Jesus? Was this protection available in the real everyday world of McIntosh County, when people's homes, jobs, and lives were threatened in response to the lawsuit they would bring? Or was the protection available only on some elevated plane, some secular heaven, whatever that would be? For example, the lasting esteem of a handful of American civil rights lawyers. But the people threw themselves upon the law nonetheless. They entered the sanctuary of the law. The law spoke to them, as it did to the lawyers, of fundamental truths. The law echoed the truth they had carved from their own lives. Men were born equal and should be treated equally. Even if the law were not able to protect them tooth and nail from local adversaries, and on this point they had profound doubts despite the lawyers' frequent assurances, they still would cast their lot with the law. If the law failed in McIntosh County, they would go down with the law. The law sounded God-given to them. They opted to trust the white lawyers. End quote. When I first went on the book tour, I guess not, I guess it was with the paperback. At some point I was traveling with this book, and it was shortly after the Rodney King jury had come back, putting the police officers, and people asked me if I saw any parallels, and what struck me then was that in LA, well, that in McIntosh, the law itself was revolutionary, and that the people came to trust the Constitution the way they trusted the Bible, and that the Constitution, they realized, held absolutely rich and valuable and current truths that would change their lives, and did. And so the Constitution itself became this radical instrument for change in McIntosh. And it seemed to me that in LA, people waited for the jury system to work, that there was sort of this pause while we waited for the jury to come back. And when the jury came back and had acquitted the people that we saw on tape beating the man, that it seemed that the law had failed and there was nothing left but anarchy. That's just how it struck me then, that people had waited to trust the law, and the law, it was felt, had fallen through for them there. Whereas in McIntosh County, it was the law itself that was this absolutely rich, powerful document. So the book is not just about the heyday of US 17 and the good old boy era, but it's about the end of it, and how about the rise of an indigenous civil rights movement brought about the end of the old ways. Finally, there's a third layer of stories that I won access to in McIntosh County. And these were the deepest, the richest, and the least obvious. These were the individual narratives, the life stories that people told me after they got to know me. In the mid-70s, I went to McIntosh often. I went as part of work, doing errands for the attorneys and being an observer. I was an observer at the election at which Thurnell Alston became the first freely chosen Black County Commissioner. And I started going down several times a week after work also. I was very moved by the language of the people. It was the sort of thickly descriptive and surprising language you could still find in pockets of the country before overexposure to television and movies had sort of flattened everyone's speech. Many of the African American people in McIntosh had no televisions. They had no electricity. There's still no theater, fast food chain, or bookstore in the whole county. So what did people do for entertainment and relaxation? They went to church several times a week and listened to the vivid and metaphorical pronouncements of their homeschooled ministers. And they got together in their dirt yards and dug barbecue pits and spent long evenings together, and they talked. They talked and talked and talked. And I listened. I'd never heard anything like it. And after they'd gotten used to me, I began to ask if I could tape them. I wasn't looking for political information, but just to tape the stories. I thought they were the most unique voices I'd ever heard, and the people were very old. One of the first people I met in the McIntosh County community was Deacon Henry Curry. He had a childhood memory of the assassination of President William McKinley. When I spoke to him, I was reminded of an essay that I had read at Oberlin by Jorge Luis Borges. You'll read him here? See it? I've not seen much of him ever since I left Oberlin, but I went back to read at Oberlin last year. And the same night that I was speaking, at the very same time, 8 o'clock, in another room, someone was giving a lecture on Borges. It's kind of funny. Some things that never change, but I have Borges here also. Borges had written a one-page essay called The Witness, in which he describes an old beggar dying in the filthy straw of a stable, forgotten by the world. In a stable, quote, in a stable lying almost in the shadow of the new stone church, a man with gray eyes and a gray beard, stretched on the ground amidst the animal odors, meekly seeks death like someone seeking sleep. You understand in reading the essay that this man's death will be no great loss to the world, but Borges writes that the old man is the last man living who knew England before Christendom. Quote, before dawn he would be dead, and with him would die, never to return, the last first-hand images of the pagan rites. The world would be poorer when this Saxon was no more. Felt the same way when I met the old people in McIntosh County, that the world would be poorer with their deaths, that Deacon Curry, who remembered President McKinley, had seen a corner of history that when he was gone would be lost. And so I had sort of the good liberal art graduates' initial instinct was to ask if I could take him, and he said yes. In fact, I never met anyone in the Black community of McIntosh that was not, did not greet me warmly and invite me in for a chat, and especially the old people were very receptive and were happy for the company. My experience in the white community was a bit different, and I went on to find out it was because the white community was feeling very protective of the sheriff, and not that they had all benefited necessarily from the crimes, but saw it as being a dead horse, and why did I have to dredge up all of this stuff about the sheriff? When I met Miss Fanny Palmer, the author of the Sheetrock Story, who's my other favorite voice in the book, She just moved into her new little house. She was a very enthusiastic and lovely lady, crippled by years of the most menial and underpaid work in the county. She had cleaned shrimp in a canning factory, and the way that was done in those years before modern electric refrigeration was she had to stand in ice. So she worked with ice piled up on her leg and worked on a table piled high with ice. So she spent her whole working life standing in ice, working in ice, because the shrimp had to be kept fresh, and it was her job to devein the shrimp and put them in the can, and it took almost all day to make a can. It would take two of you to make the can, and you'd get a nickel for the can. And in the book, there's a lot of her description of that work. Even after retirement, she never felt warm. I'd visit her on a glorious fall day, clear sky, 80 degrees, and find her inside, hunched over her gas heater, wrapped in shawls and blankets, but always very cheerful and sweet. She could hardly walk and could hardly move her hands as a result of the years of working in ice. Her hands were sort of permanently clenched, and watching her pick up a paper cup of apple juice, I remember watching how she had to try to hold it between her two fists, and she walked as if she was club-footed. Her voice was dry and harsh and rough. She was nearly toothless. She had this very thick coastal dialect, and I could hardly understand a word she said. She lived alone with an adult retarded son who could not serve as a translator, but people had said to me, you need to talk to Miss Fanny. She was kind of the matriarch of the community, so I went time after time after time to try to talk to Miss Fanny, and I couldn't understand a word she said to me. And I would, in the evening, bring back to Savannah my tape recorder, and I remember sitting at my desk in Savannah trying to transcribe Miss Fanny's tapes and hitting play, rewind, play, and on the tape, my little high-pitched questions. Tell me about this. This rock, this gutter kind of rock. And I'd wait till the sound stopped, and I'd say, and then what happened? This perfect sound. I read the rows of transcribed syllables aloud to myself, and sometimes miraculously I began to hear sentences. I loved deciphering Fanny Palmer. It was kind of a writer's version of archaeology. I felt that I needed a Rosetta Stone. And when I finished, they were on the page were the most moving stories I'd ever heard. Once I had them transcribed, I would then go visit her again and ask her the same questions. And this time when she would tell me her stories, I could follow it and see that I had it right. And I'm going to close by reading to you the Sheetrock Story. When Fanny Palmer had been in her new little wooden house a year, she still could detect the odors of lumber, paint, and varnish from the days of its construction. She sniffed for them. One closet still had curlicues of sawdust on the floor. She would never sweep them up. They were precious to her, like traces of talcum powder on the floor of an old nursery when all the babies had grown and gone. Men came from all over the county and nailed the box of her house together, while she and her youngest son, a retarded man of 35, stood by. Her old house, a sharecropper's shack, stood tilted in the backyard of the new house. She had raised her family in it, but it was falling to pieces, sinking into the ancient, overgrown tobacco field, the rows of which once had come right up to her door. The cabin had become like part of the woods itself. The sunlight lay in pale yellow lines on the wood floor, as it would on the floor of the forest, because it came through the gaps between the planks of the roof. The inside walls of the house were one side of ancient, crusty 2x4s, and the exterior walls were the other side of the same planks. The windows were open squares covered with wax paper. On winter nights, Fanny and her son put on sweaters, coats, hats, gloves, and shoes before getting into bed. Her husband, the night he died, said to her, "Get you a house for you and the boy." And as I described earlier in the chapter, her husband had worked equally hard. He had felled trees and had to be in the woods at 4 in the morning, felling the tall, tall trees and to make planks of wood out of them. And it was a similar story. It would take almost all day to make a plank, and you got, whatever, 50 cents for the plank. The night he died, her husband had said, "Get you a house for you and the boy." But there appeared to be no way she could get a house, though she and her son were freezing to death. Every winter in Georgia, old people in these shacks freeze to death. Fanny put on a whole closet full of clothes and lay down shivering. But then God made a miracle. And this is her voice, but you just have to picture the rough sound of it. "I've been getting $90 Social Security, that's all I've been getting. I put down $40 to the 100. I get 100, put them down. Get 100, put them down. Sometimes I didn't get nothing to eat, but the other house been old. Sometimes I would need a shoe. Sometimes my boy would need a shoe. I wouldn't get me no shoe. I would get my boy a shoe. Then I see a young fella that used to stay over there. I say, 'Could you build my house for me?' That my grandson. He say, 'Grandma, you can't build no house because you ain't getting nothing much, and we ain't able to give you.' I say, 'Well, I'm going down to God and ask God to help me. He say if you come to him in earnest, he going to help you. You make one step, God going to make two. I say, all right, God, I'm going to make the step. You know I need the house. My house falling down. All right? The next year, they raised my check to 125, so I start a man on the house. He do a little bit at a time. He come at 8 o'clock and be gone at 9, and I don't see him before the next day. That's just the way he be doing. It be getting cold. I asked him one day, when you think you'll let me get in the house? He said, well, next year, January. I say, well, praise God, there ain't no place for us to sleep. I lay down and asked the Lord, say, Lord, I ain't got my husband, ain't got my mama, got nothing to help me, and I didn't make the first step. So are you going to make the two? I asked the Lord. All right. Next, a young girl come here one day, a white girl. She say, Miss Palmer? I say, uh-huh. She said, when you gonna get this house done, Miss Palmer? I say, God knows. She say, Miss Palmer? I say, uh-huh. She say, God sure is good to you, because I want you to sign a blank for me and tell us what you has got and all your business. I signed the thing and she gone. It'd been a month before I hear from why I signed. One day a man come by here from Savannah. He going down that road there. He say, I'm looking for a lady called Miss Palmer. My boy say, that my mother, she here. He say, Miss Palmer? I say, uh-huh. He say, we got information about a little house that ain't got nobody to build it. The government want us to help you finish it. I say, thank you, God. So the next week he sends some boys and they make these rooms and put in a toilet. Now ain't that been God? That was the Lord. You got to love everybody. I love the white just as good as I love some of my own color. Now that's a white fellow would come to me. But then we got to struggle. Ain't had no sheetrock and no more money and the house can't be built. And that man say, you won't find a woman white or colored that could build a house like that with no money. I asked them to take the tin off the old house, but it wouldn't go around a house this big. So they put a little tar on it for me. I lay down and I cried. I said, Lord, they can't finish my house. We ain't got no sheetrock. Please help me, Lord. The night me and my boy come in this house, that night I took sick. I've been so sick till I didn't know. I just been taking cold going from the house. Ain't had no sheetrock. I said, well, Lord, don't know how we're going to get the sheetrock. Praise God, I done take the first step. I need you to take the two. So, a young girl come here from the state road, say, Miss Palmer? I said, She said, where are your son? I said, he gone. She said, Lord, if your son been here, there are 2 trucks wrecked on the state road with sheetrock. And the people carrying it, and they charging them nothing. I mean, that good sheetrock, too, they be going up north with it. So I phoned a house up the road, and one of my grandboys been home. So he took his truck, and he gone, and he bring a load and pile it up in there. I say, you think you can get any more? He say, yeah. So he gone and bring another load. So now when the man come to put it up, he say, where you get this sheetrock, Fanny? I say, ain't God is a good God? I say, that truck wreck. He say, this sheetrock will cover all the house. This sheetrock would have cost $1,000. It'd cover all the house and left 2 sheets. And my granddaughter gathered the 2 sheets. Ain't that been a good God? Ain't that been a good God? I'll tell you one more thing. That's the Sheetrock Story. I wanted to name the book after that story. It's my favorite story in the book, and if pressed, I could argue that it stands for a community coming out of an era during which if you're freezing to death in the winter, you need to pray. For sheetrock, into an era in which if you're freezing to death, you need to elect your own leadership and get some federal money. And I liked the title, and the publishers liked the title, and everyone was pleased except my mother. And she called and said, but you can't name the book this, because sheetrock, she knew, is a trade name. It's like Kleenex or Frigidaire. It's the trade name for wallboard or drywall. But sheetrock is a trade name. She said, you can't put a trade name on a book. And she said, besides people outside the South aren't going to know what sheetrock is anyway. So I said, let me look into it. So I found 2 books. It was all I could find that had trade names in the title. I found Looking for Mr. Goodbar and The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. And I presented these to my mother, and she was still not happy, and called one night when I was out and left a message with my husband, and my husband wrote it down and said, your mother called and urges you once more to change the name of the book to Praying for Wallboard. So we had a big publication party when the book came out. A lot of people from Macintosh came up for it and so on. My husband's a criminal defense lawyer, and he took this little note, he had saved this little note that he'd written to me about my mother, and he blew it out like to this size, your mother called, Praying for Wallboard, and he had it set up, we were having the party, and my mother was there, and we just all had a good laugh at her expense, ha ha ha. So, a few months later, the book was published, and I got a letter one day from a big law firm in Chicago. It's one of these law firms, heading and 500 lawyers on the left column, and it was the senior partner writing to me, dear Ms. Greene, our firm represents the United States Gypsum Corporation, manufacturers of sheetrock. and they had a copyright infringement complaint, which was, and I don't have a hardback with me. Do any of you have a hardback? Ooh, well, save money. In the hardback, sheetrock is capitalized inside, which it needs to be, just as if you wrote Kleenex or something. But in the hardback on the dust cover, where it sort of summarized the book, it said, and Fanny Palmer, an old woman living in an ancient sharecropper shack, prays to the Lord for sheetrock, and sheetrock is delivered. Well, that sheetrock was not capitalized. So this law firm was demanding that all 40,000 dust covers be destroyed. They said they found the trademark misuse to be very poignant. And I mean, I thought this was all hilarious, and this was just the funniest thing I'd ever heard, but the attorneys for Addison Wesley didn't think it was equally funny, although they said they had never encountered a poignant copyright infringement case before, and they were really pleased that it was just so damn poignant, but it was a problem. So what the U.S. Gypsum Company wanted was that they should be destroyed and that the text should be rewritten to read, and Fanny Palmer, an old woman living in an ancient sharecropper shack, prays to the Lord for sheetrock, a product of the United States Gypsum Corporation. Sheetrock, a product of the United States Gypsum Corporation, is delivered. So Addison Wesley declined, and so they really could not do this, but they would communicate with the paperback company, and on the paperback, they agreed, and on the very back of the paperback, in small letters at the bottom, it says, sheetrock is a registered trademark of the United States Gypsum Corporation. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much for your attention. Do you want to ask questions, or is your retired time up?
How did you know a publisher would be interested in that kind of book? Or did you have a feel, or you just wrote it and it went out?
No, when you write a nonfiction book, the rule is not.
We're back. How was that, Melissa?
Really, I'm kind of choked up because I lost my mother a few years ago, and she had bought me that outrageous looking jacket, which was just stylish as hell at the time. And just referring to her in the talk, and I feel you always miss your mother if you lose your mother. So, but also, I still give that talk. When I give the talk now, I don't mention the dice game because I came to think it was too complicated. I'm curious here. Did that make sense to people? Could you picture what a cheating game that was, and that you had to roll 8 6s to win?
It seems very, very fascinating. I loved the whole thing, and I'm so grateful that you were willing to share this moment with us. One of the reasons I think it's so important to have these From the Archives events is because we have these, and these are part of the Writers Festival history, and it feels very miserly to keep them in the archives away from new audiences and new people who might want to go play razzle dazzle or who should stay far away. Well, thank you, Melissa, and thank you to everybody in the audience. It has been just a really great treat to look back at this moment, incredible fashions included. And we're really grateful to you, Melissa, for joining us today.
Thank you all for coming. I really, really appreciate it. And to those of my students, extra credit, whatever.
Absolutely.
But thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen one last time with our thank you slide, but you're free to go. Have a nice afternoon, and we'll see you back in an hour and a half for Chiana Clark.